Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Greece on June 6, 2025 for Reason to Resist. On June 2nd, the Toronto Star reported for the first time that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, had commenced an investigation into, quote, potential war crimes related to the Israel-Hamas conflict, close quote. With this announcement, the Canadian government's kabuki theater has descended to a new low. Now, what do I mean by kabuki theater? As those of you who are followers of Reason to Resist will know, I often use the term kabuki theater to describe the efforts by Western governments to distance themselves from the heinous crimes of their rabid Israeli attack dog. The origin of the term kabuki theater is Japanese. It refers to a classical form of Japanese theater that is known for its heavily stylized performances, its glamorous, highly decorated costumes, and the elaborate makeup worn by its performers. Just as performers in kabuki theater go to extravagant lengths to present a fictional story, so too do Western governments in the public discourse around Israel and Palestine. So what is this Toronto Star report all about? Before I examine the Toronto Star story about the RCMP, it's important to bear in mind that the Toronto Star is based in Canada's largest city, and it has the largest daily circulation of any newspaper in Canada, at almost 2.4 million copies per week. In addition, the Toronto Star is widely perceived, and with good reason, to be aligned politically with the governing Liberal Party of Canada, currently led by the newly elected Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Therefore, if the Liberal government wanted to plant a story in the Canadian media, there's hardly a better place it could go than the Toronto Star. The Toronto Star article begins with these two paragraphs. The RCMP says it is investigating potential war crimes related to the Israel-Hamas conflict. Very few details of the RCMP's probe into what it called the Israel-Hamas conflict are known, with the police service confirming the investigation to the Star on Monday, but refusing to answer questions about its scope. Nowhere in this 24-paragraph Toronto Star article, written by reporter Ben Musset, do we learn how Musset came to suspect that the RCMP might be conducting such an investigation. Did the RCMP reach out to the Star on its own initiative? Did someone in the Liberal government suggest to Musset that the RCMP was conducting such an investigation? Or did a light bulb suddenly go off in his head and he thought to himself after 19 months of genocide, gee, I wonder if the RCMP is conducting an investigation of potential war crimes related to the Israel-Hamas conflict. If Musset contacted the RCMP on his own initiative, why did he do it now, so long after the genocide began? Since Musset's article leaves these questions unanswered, I sent him an email yesterday and asked him who initiated the communications between the Star and the RCMP about this investigation. Did the RCMP contact the Star and alert the Star to the investigation, or was it the Star that contacted the RCMP? So far, I've received no response to my email to Ben Musset. In any event, and as Musset noted in his article, the RCMP refused to answer questions about the scope of its investigation. In fact, the Toronto Star article does not even reveal which party to this conflict is being investigated by the RCMP. Is it Hamas? Is it Israel? Is it both? This ambiguity did not prevent some observers from concluding that the RCMP was investigating dual Israeli-Canadian citizens who have served in Israel's military over the past 19 months. One media organization that came to that hasty conclusion is Ynet, a news website that is widely read in Israel. On the day after the Toronto Star article appeared, Ynet published an article with the headline, Canada opens war crimes probe into dual Israeli-Canadian IDF soldiers. The Ynet report stated that, quote, the RCMP's move has triggered concern and controversy within Canada's Jewish and Israeli communities. Ynet based its claims on the Toronto Star article, but the Toronto Star article makes no mention whatsoever of dual Israeli-Canadian soldiers in Israel's military. To his credit, the Star's Ben Musset did not give the RCMP a complete free ride in his article. Musset pointed out, for example, that whereas the RCMP told the public nothing about this investigation for more than a year after it began, the RCMP took a dramatically different approach to its investigation into possible war crimes related to the war in Ukraine. That investigation involved a hotline and a dedicated webpage, media interviews, online advertising, signs erected at airports, and questionnaires distributed in an attempt to collect witness testimony from Ukrainians fleeing the war. The webpage for the RCMP's Ukraine investigation indicates that it was last modified on April 7, 2022. This means that the RCMP established its website for its investigation into the Ukraine war less than 6 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine. We are now more than 19 months beyond the day on which Israel's genocide began, and the RCMP still has no webpage dedicated to its investigation into what it calls the Israel-Hamas conflict. Nor has the RCMP employed online advertising, signs erected at airports, or questionnaires to collect witness testimony from Palestinian Canadians or from the very few Palestinians who have managed to escape Gaza and come to Canada. The RCMP has done far less to publicize its investigation into the Israel-Hamas conflict than it did to publicize its investigation into the Ukraine war, and it has done far less despite the fact that Israel has killed far more civilians in Gaza than Russia has killed in Ukraine, and Israel has done this in far less time than the Russians have been fighting on the ground in Ukraine. Moreover, why does the RCMP refer to the genocide in Gaza as the Israel-Hamas conflict? Sure, Israeli forces are trying very hard to kill Hamas fighters. I won't dispute that. But it's now obvious to anyone with a functioning brain and an ounce of conscience that Israel is using Hamas as a justification for exterminating the civilian population of Gaza. Therefore, the phrase Israel-Hamas conflict is highly misleading. It centers the focus on Hamas, whereas the focus at this stage should be on the starving and terrorized civilian population of Gaza. By calling it the Israel-Hamas war, which is precisely what Zionist propagandists would want the RCMP to say, the RCMP is revealing precisely where its sympathies lie in this investigation. But no one should be surprised that the RCMP has evidently a pro-Israel bias. After all, for many years, the RCMP has taken part in active training maneuvers with Israel's military forces. RCMP members served with Israeli forces as part of Operation Proteus, which the Canadian government describes as, quote, Canada's contribution to the Office of the United States Security Coordinator in Jerusalem, close quote. And of course, we know where the loyalty of the United States government lies in this conflict. Now, returning to the Toronto Star article, it discloses some interesting, albeit limited information about the nature of the investigation. It states, the RCMP calls these types of probes structural investigations, which fall under Canada's Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes program, a joint effort by the RCMP, Department of Justice, Canada Border Services Agency, and Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. According to its mandate, the War Crimes program supports Canada's commitment towards international justice and the fight against impunity for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The program is intended to deny safe haven to war criminals and seek accountability for alleged atrocities, either by sharing evidence with other authorities or trying individuals in Canadian courts, the Justice Department said. And this is the money shot. It's exceedingly rare, however, for cases to end up in Canadian courts. That, my friends, is an understatement. Indeed, in 2020, Amnesty International issued a report in which it blasted Canada's government for failing to prosecute war crimes. Amnesty noted that since Canada enacted the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act in 2000, it had prosecuted only 2 individuals for war crimes, and both of those individuals were Africans involved in the genocide in Rwanda. In the 25 years since Canada enacted the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, Canada has not prosecuted a single war crimes claim against a Westerner or a citizen of a country allied with Canada. Let's examine a clear-cut case in which the RCMP failed to act. On October 20th, 2011, former U.S. President George W. Bush came to Canada, and specifically the Canadian province of British Columbia, to give a speech, by the way, for which he was richly compensated. Days before his arrival in Canada, Amnesty International called on the Canadian government to arrest Bush and prosecute him for war crimes. So too did Human Rights Watch, which is based in the United States. Fearing that the Canadian government would give the war criminal George Bush a free pass, the admirable U.S. Center for Constitutional Rights filed what is known as a private prosecution against Bush in a British Columbia court. The criminal complaint against Bush was filed on behalf of 4 men: Hassan bin Attash, Sami El-Haj, Mohammed Khan Tumani, and Murat Kurnaz, each of whom endured years of inhumane treatment, including beatings, chaining to cell walls, being hung from walls or ceilings while handcuffed, lack of access to toilets, sleep, food, and water deprivation, exposure to extreme temperatures, sensory overload and deprivation, and other horrific and illegal treatment while in U.S. custody at military bases in Afghanistan and or at the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay. However, almost immediately upon the commencement of this private prosecution by the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Canadian government persuaded a court in British Columbia to block it. The court blocked it because it accepted the government's argument that there was no realistic prospect that Canada's Attorney General would consent to the prosecution, which is a requirement for prosecutions under Canada's war crimes legislation. Now, if ever there was a slam dunk case for war crimes, this was it. Bush is undoubtedly a war criminal. How do we know for certain that Bush authorized the use of torture, a war crime? Because another U.S. president told us so. That U.S. president was Barack Obama. Back in 2009, 2 years before George Bush's 2011 visit to Canada, Obama stated publicly that waterboarding was torture, and it was by then known that waterboarding and other so-called enhanced interrogation techniques had been approved at the highest levels of the Bush administration as part of its so-called war on terror. Quite apart from the infamous case of George W. Bush, it is well known to the Canadian government that thousands of Canadians have served in Israel's criminal military throughout the 57-year period that Israel has been occupying the West Bank and building settlements illegally in that occupied territory. Israel's West Bank settlements clearly constitute war crimes. Canadian citizens also served in the Israeli military during Israel's 2014 assault on Gaza, in which, again, Israel committed multiple war crimes. Canadians have served in Israel's military during the many years that Israel has been committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. Canadians also served in Israel's military during the 2018 Great March of Return in Gaza, during which Israel again committed multiple war crimes. During the Great March of Return, Israeli forces gunned down hundreds of unarmed Palestinians, including journalists, disabled persons, children, and even a Canadian Palestinian doctor by the name of Tarek Lubani. More recently, in 2024, the independent Canadian website or news outlet, The Maple, established a public database of Canadians who have served in Israel's military since its genocide began in October 2023. By February of this year, The Maple had identified 85 Canadians who've served in Israel's military during this genocide. In effect, The Maple admirably performed a sizable chunk of the investigative work that the RCMP should have performed long ago if it was doing its job. Throughout the decades that Israel has committed countless war crimes and crimes against humanity, Canada's government has not prosecuted a single Canadian Israeli for war crimes or crimes against humanity. Not one. By failing to act all these years, Canadian and other Western law enforcement agencies have sent a loud and clear message to Israel that under no circumstances will they hold Israel accountable for its crimes. This certainly has emboldened Israel. It has led, in fact, inexorably to the horrors we are witnessing today. The question remains, nonetheless, why did the RCMP disclose at this time, more than 1 year after it commenced its investigation into the so-called Israel-Hamas conflict, that it's investigating war crimes related to that conflict? The Toronto Star article gives no explanation as to the reason, as I've mentioned earlier. However, if you want to understand what a government's true agenda is, its timing can tell you a great deal. The timing of government announcements is often the key to understanding the government's real objectives. So what is going on right now that could possibly explain why the RCMP made this announcement so late in the game? Well, as we previously reported on Reason to Resist, the governments of Canada, France, and Britain issued an unprecedented joint statement on May 19th. In that statement, they explicitly threatened Israel with sanctions for the very first time. In particular, they asserted, quote, "We oppose any attempt to expand settlements in the West Bank. Israel must halt settlements which are illegal and undermine the viability of a Palestinian state and the security of both Israelis and Palestinians. We will not hesitate to take further action, including targeted sanctions." How did Israel respond to this threat? It showed its allies the big, fat middle finger. On May 29th, 10 days after the joint Canada-France-UK threat, Israel's finance minister announced that Israel had approved 22 new Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli anti-settlement watchdog Peace Now called it, quote, "the most extensive move of its kind," closed quote, in more than 30 years, and warned that it would dramatically reshape the West Bank and entrench the occupation even further. Even worse, the genocidal entity's defense minister, Israel Katz, specifically stated that the move, quote, "prevents the establishment of a Palestinian state," close quote. For decades, Canada's formal policy, as that of many other Western governments, has been a purported commitment to a Palestinian state coexisting peacefully alongside the State of Israel. Therefore, Israel's May 29 announcement on settlement expansion constituted brazen defiance not only of Canada's May 19th threat, it also constituted an unambiguous rejection of Canada's supposed commitment to a Palestinian state. With Israel's May 29 statement, Canada's government was now in a serious bind. Effectively, Israel had boxed it into a corner by publicly adopting a settlement expansion plan that unambiguously contradicted Canada's demand. It was in this context that the CBC, Canada's public broadcaster, published a lengthy article about the bind that Canada's government was now in. The article, which appeared on the CBC's website on May 30th, was authored by Evan Dyer. Its headline was, quote, "Israel's provocative settlement response may force Canada to back up its words," close quote. In the article, Evan Dyer quoted multiple Canadian experts on international relations, all of whom took the position that Canada's credibility would be severely undermined if it did not now sanction Israel. A mere 3 days later, 3 days after the CBC story appeared, we learned for the first time of the RCMP's investigation into possible war crimes related to the Israel-Hamas conflict. An investigation, as I've stated, that began quietly more than 1 year ago. Now, some of you may believe in coincidences. I don't, certainly not in circumstances such as these. After years of watching Canada's government cynically manipulate public opinion with its kabuki theater, I simply cannot believe that this article is a coincidence. In my view, the most plausible explanation by far for the sudden discovery by the Toronto Star of the RCMP's investigation was that the Carney government is trying to alleviate public pressure to sanction Israel, pressure which is growing, because the government really does not want to sanction Israel, no matter how satanic its crimes may be. The overwhelming likelihood, in my view, is that by planting this story in the sympathetic Toronto Star at this time, the Canadian government is positioning itself to say that it is doing something, at least something, to deal with Israel's contemptuous response to Canada's sanctions threat. But as I've explained, there's no reason to think that this time will be any different. After decades of inaction by Canadian law enforcement on Israeli and other Western war crimes, it is unlikely in the extreme that the RCMP will finally act. Indeed, the RCMP just issued a clarifying statement which gives us no cause for hope for any prosecutions of Israeli-Canadian war criminals. On June 4th, the day after the Toronto Star article appeared, the RCMP branch in London, Ontario stated, quote, "It is important to emphasize that a structural investigation is not a criminal investigation, close quote. So there you have it, folks. The RCMP's so-called investigation into possible war crimes related to the Israel-Hamas conflict is not even criminal in nature. At this stage, 19 months after the most publicized genocide in human history began, the RCMP has not even commenced a criminal investigation, let alone an actual prosecution against any Israeli-Canadian war criminal. To add insult to injury, the RCMP claimed in its June 4 clarifying statement that it has not yet set up a secure online portal to accept submissions on possible war crimes in Gaza because of what it called technical challenges. Of course, the RCMP discloses no information as to the nature of those technical challenges, nor does it explain why this agency, whose annual budget is nearly $7 billion, has failed to resolve these supposed technical challenges more than 19 months after Israel's genocidal rampage began. Finally, the RCMP's clarifying statement made no reference at all to Israeli-Canadian dual citizens serving in Israel's military, nor did it reveal which side of the conflict is being investigated by the RCMP. Is the RCMP investigating Palestinian militants? Is it investigating Israel soldiers? Is it investigating both? We simply don't know. On the contrary, the RCMP concluded its clarifying statement with these words: "Given the sensitivity of the matter, we urge the public to refrain from drawing premature conclusions about the RCMP's role or intent. This initiative is solely focused on collecting relevant information and does not target any community or group." So that's it, folks. Expect nothing from this so-called investigation. Canada's Kabuki theater not only continues, it is becoming increasingly absurd. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, we, the people, have not yet applied sufficient pressure on our governments to finally do the minimally decent thing and sanction Israel. We simply must escalate the pressure now. Time is of the essence. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Greece on June 6, 2025.